Welcome, grade 7s. It's lesson 8.6. What was Louis Riel's role in preserving the Métis identity? We'll take a look at Louis Riel, Métis identity as a whole, and probably a few other things. So stick around and let's learn something. What was Louis Riel's role in preserving the Métis identity? Like I said in the opening video, this is lesson 8.6. In the last lesson, we learned about the creation of the 5th province of Canada, that of Manitoba. And we also learned that in that time, Louis Riel, who we were introduced to a few lessons previously, he was banished to the United States for 5 years. And some bad things were still happening to the Métis from Canadian soldiers, or at the hands of Canadian soldiers. And the Métis that were still living in Manitoba at the time continued to elect Louis Riel to be their member of parliament. And this is going to lead us to the second Metis Uprising, which happens in 1885. The problems that existed when the Métis provisional government was in place were not solved when Canada created Manitoba in the Manitoba Act. There were still disagreements over land ownership. There was obviously still fears of assimilation. And the concerns held by Metis and First Nations, they were still being ignored by the government. So this is going to lead us eventually to the second Metis Uprising. There's going to be a lot of problems, especially back then. The government of Canada was not listening to the Métis in Manitoba. One of the things is that the Métis were guaranteed 240 acres of land each. For each family. Each family is going to get 240 acres of land. That's a lot of land. So, to get this land, the government of Canada issued something called a scrip. And you are Métis, you would take your script and you would go to the land office and you would trade it in and they would give you the land that you wanted. The newcomers, they wanted land as well, and they wanted to model the society in Manitoba after that society in Ontario. The Métis, on the other hand, they were scared of assimilation. They had very rightful fears of that. And the script that they were given for the exchange of land wasn't even the best land to farm. And this angered the Métis. They wanted to keep Métis together, so they thought that they could gather their script and they could get all of this land together. But that's not what was happening, because newcomers were kind of interspersed where the Métis wanted to claim their land. So the Métis left Manitoba and they headed more to the west and more to the north. And their goal was to live life as they had before the creation of Manitoba, before the newcomers were coming into this part of North America. But at the same time, we had the fur trade expanding. We had more newcomers arriving, and the buffalo began to disappear. The Métis, who were traditionally buffalo hunters, they turned to ranching and then they turned to logging. So they were diversifying their experiences and their economy. The Métis, who were now being led by Gabriel Dumont, they set up their own government and they set up their laws based off of that buffalo hunt. Even though the last time they made a Métis provisional government, there was problems with Canada, and it looked as if the Métis were opposing the Canadian government yet again. And this is going to anger quite a few people. But the Métis and the First Nations, they had various grievances. And to avoid any kind of starvation, the First Nations, they entered into something called numbered treaties with the Canadian government. Some of the Métis were allowed to join these treaties. Others could not join the treaties. And the Métis themselves, as individual Métis, as a group of Métis, as a culture of Métis, they also weren't allowed to make these treaties. And this map is making an appearance again. These are the numbered treaties throughout Canadian history that the Canadian government made with First Nations in those respective areas. And it granted them things like healthcare and education and farming equipment. And there's various things that were involved in these treaties. And these treaties were nation-to-nation agreements that were supposed to stand the test of time. So here are some of the concerns. This is going to be a long one here, but here are some of our concerns that are being held by both the Métis and the First Nations. The Métis were concerned that they've been cheated from their land in Manitoba. They were there well before Manitoba became a province, and they felt that they were being cheated out of that land. Outside of Manitoba, so outside of that actual province of Manitoba, the land ownership was very unclear. And the Métis that moved out of Manitoba, they were living on property that had been claimed by the Hudson's Bay Company or by the Canadian Pacific Railway, which we'll be learning about a little bit later. The newcomers, they were moving further into the west, and the Métis feared that they were losing their land and their jobs to these newcomers. They also feared being assimilated into the new society that was emerging. So the newcomers, there was a lot of them coming, so they thought that they were going to be the dominant society. We heard already that the buffalo were disappearing because of overhunting, and because of that, the livelihoods of the Métis needed to change. A lot of those livelihoods ended up disappearing. The federal government was ignoring all of these problems, even though the Métis were sending petition after petition, 15 petitions in all, to Ottawa, and none of those were being answered. For concerns of the First Nations, well, the government did not keep some of the promises that it made to provide food and farming equipment to First Nations. Even though that they were signing these treaties, the government still did not follow through on their agreements. Like the Métis, we have the buffalo disappearing because of overhunting by outsiders, which is going to change the First Nations' way of life. Some First Nations, they began starving because the government restricted much of their movement, and it made it very difficult for them to hunt and find food if they weren't allowed to travel freely. Because of that, the government promised rations, food rations as a repayment, but that didn't come through. The newcomers, they thought that with the arrival of the newcomers, that they wouldn't be able to hold on to any of the good land that was left for the First Nations. They thought that the newcomers would take it all. And some of the First Nations, they wanted a large territory where people, all of their people, could live together. Instead, what the government did is the government forced them to live on tiny reserves and separated the various First Nation communities that were already in existence through traditional ties and traditional agreements. So these were the main concerns that were being brought forth by both the Métis and by the First Nations. But the Canadian government is ignoring all of this. The Canadian government doesn't care about the grievances that are being held by the Métis and the First Nations. So they've been told this. The government has been told this because officials that were in Manitoba and west and north of Manitoba were telling the federal government that there is these tensions, and you could feel these tensions in the air. They were advising Ottawa to do something, because if they don't, another uprising is going to happen. But the government, they just ignored all the advice. What they were only mainly focused on was the westward expansion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the CPR. This was the number one priority for the Canadian government at this time. They could have cared less about the concerns of First Nations and Métis. Now you remember, in the previous lesson, Riel gets banished. Well, Riel now returns, and the Métis petition Ottawa to address all of those concerns that they were having, but they're ignored. So Métis is now on, Riel is on his way back. So Gabriel Dumont brings back Louis Riel. And Riel, he's in the center of this picture here. He sets up a Métis government in Batoche, and he sends more demands to Ottawa, specifically food and land demands. But guess what happens? Ottawa, yet once again, starting to see a pattern here, people. They ignore the demands that the Métis and Riel send to Ottawa. So Riel and Dumont convinced the Métis that they need to take up arms a second time. It didn't work the first time. We did create Manitoba, however. It must work this second time. So they convinced the Métis to take up arms a second time. So in 1885, the Northwest Mounted Police are at the Duck Lake and are defeated by this uprising that's taken place. And the Cree First Nation joined this Métis resistance. So now this resistance is getting larger. And then there's more death that happens at the forts at Frog Lake. Now, at this time, there is a police force there. And some of them, along with their families, they are allowed to leave the area unharmed because the Métis are saying, okay, go, you can leave. We're not going to harm you. Go and tell the government what is happening. So the government reacts. And how they react is by using their focus on the CPR to now move soldiers west. So Canadian soldiers are now coming in. And they advance on the Métis in Batoche. This is where the government for the Métis was set up. And 3 days of fighting ensues, and approximately 300 Métis, Cree, and Dakota end up surrendering. We have 53 soldiers die, 118 are injured, and 35 First Nations and Métis are dead. And dozens upon dozens of Métis are imprisoned. Not really the outcome that the Métis were hoping for, not really the outcome that the Canadian government was hoping for, to be honest with you. And the government is now looking at who's responsible for this. And all fingers are pointing to Louis Riel. Riel surrenders and stands trial for treason. Treason is the betrayal of one's country. Now, we're having a little bit of a disagreement here because Riel sets up his own government. They want their own nation. And he's found guilty of betraying the Canadian government, not fully recognized by the Métis because of everything that has been happening. Nonetheless, Riel is found guilty. There's a jury that finds him guilty. And he's sentenced to death by hanging. John A. MacDonald, he's a little bit torn. He's not sure what to do. So he stays the execution twice, but he's unable to stay it the third time because there is an election that's about to take place. If MacDonald stays the execution and lets Riel off, he is going to upset his main voting base, which is going to be in Ontario. Ontario most of them thought that Métis leader Louis Riel was a traitor and a murderer. So they wanted to see him punished. So if MacDonald doesn't punish him, he is going to lose the votes coming out of Ontario, which means he will not win the election because there's more people in Ontario. So he needs to win Ontario to win this election. Quebec, the Canadiens, see Riel as a hero. They thought Riel was defending French language rights and the Catholic religion out in Western Canada. So they were on Riel's side. But there was fewer people in Quebec. So if MacDonald doesn't get the support of Quebec, that's okay. As long as he has full support of Ontario, he will win this election. So this is his dilemma. Do we let Riel go, or do we hang him for his involvement in the second Metis Uprising? Guess what he does? He goes with the Ontario voters and he says, Riel shall hang, though every dog in Quebec shall bark. So basically he is saying that he is going to go through with this execution, and that's exactly what happens. On November 16th, 1885, Riel is hanged, and the Canadiens in Quebec, they all blame the English for this hanging. And the death of Riel confirmed to them in Quebec that this partnership, in air quotations, it's an unequal partnership between the French and the English, because whatever the English want, they are saying, is whatever is going to be whatever they get. So whatever they want, they get. The government then continues to tighten its grip. Macdonald does not want to see a third uprising take place, or any uprising from here on after. So the government has to tighten its stronghold on the country, and the Northwest Territories stays as one, even though the Métis wanted it to be split into two so that they could get some land and set up another government. Land script came back, but the Métis, they didn't want this script, so they sold it off for much less than it was actually worth. In the aftermath of the hanging of Louis Riel, many First Nations are found guilty. They sentenced 44 to prison. 8 were sentenced to death. The food rations stopped, starving the First Nations even more. And the government opened more land up to both the European settlers that were coming over and to the railway. And the last thing to tighten its grip, the Canadian government sent in a large military presence to keep peace and order, which, if you are Métis or First Nation, you are not going to agree with any of these things that have happened. And this was almost an attack from the Canadian government on the Métis and the First Nations. All right, head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.